in your family, a part of your family. My dad and I cherish the Stoops, and I feel very fortunate to be spending this week with you all, and particularly with this family. I would like to spend a little bit of time this morning speaking about the church of the first century. I'm not going to speak of any one particular apostle this morning, but rather the movement the apostles left behind. Thank you, Brother Condon. My theme for this morning has an unusual source of inspiration. In a widely publicized interview, Ted Turner, the billionaire husband of Jane Fonda, owner of the Atlanta Braves and the Turner Broadcasting Network, called Christianity a religion for losers. And this may be the only statement that Turner has made in his life with which I agree. And in the time I have today, I want to tell you why I think this may be the most fitting summary of the way the New Testament church saw itself. This theme has already been struck this morning. Brother Stoops and I have not coordinated in any way, but he has already quoted the central passage from which I'm speaking. Not many wise, but the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. I would like to ask you today for your patience. I'm going to build steadily a foundation. I'm going to go over some information that might be unfamiliar to you, but is very important for you to know about the first century, particularly about the culture of the Roman Empire. I'd like for this to be a classroom this morning, and the classroom is going to turn into, I believe, by the end, an upper room. So to begin, in 1857, archaeologists discovered on Rome's Palatine Hill a building that served as a boarding school for boys in the 1st and 2nd centuries. On one of the walls of one of the boarding schools, they discovered what is now called the Blasphemo Graffito. And I believe we have it overhead behind me. So I'd like you to come with me now, 20 centuries into the past, and stand with me here near the wall of that old boarding school, amid the laughter of boys running steps in the hall, teachers writing on chalkboard, a chorus of voices repeating the Roman alphabet in unison. Watch two boys. Do you see them? They're looking over their shoulders to make sure everything is clear. And they sneer, and then etch deep into the wall a picture with their crude instrument of a crucified donkey. And a boy standing beneath the crucifixion, raising his hand in worship towards the donkey. And in crude letters, the boys write, Alexamenos worships his God. Alexamenos sebeto theon. Alexamenos worships his God. This is a picture of Alex, who was apparently a 1st century Christian in Rome. A boy who probably attended that boarding school. And he was one of those unusual, deviant children that everyone whispered about and made fun of for being a part of this strange and illicit or illegal religion called the Christians. And here they are making fun of Alex for worshiping what they believe to be a donkey upon a cross. Jesus of Nazareth. My work in this session is something like those 19th century archaeologists. I'm going to try to remove the layers of history that has seen Christianity transform from a band of rejects into a religion with nearly 3 billion adherents today. I want you to see our faith for a moment through the lens not of the 3 billion adherents, but rather through the mocking eyes of those two boys making fun of Alex, the Christian. The religion of Rome and the religion practiced by this small band of believers called Christians, I want to compare the two. And let's look at their respective prospects and see which of the two from within the first century would be the one that would survive the ravages of time. Rome's religion or the Christians' religion. Let's start with Jesus, the founder, the object of the worship of this small band of rejects. At least according to the fact checkers of the day, of the first century, he was considered a criminal. Rome knew how to handle those who put peace at risk. Some years before Jesus, a certain popular slave named Spartacus fell into the hands of Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the great Roman triumvir. And Crassus, to put down this slave rebellion of movement against Rome itself, lined 70 miles of the Appian Way, the great highway of the day, with crosses, 70 miles worth of crosses, and he crucified thousands and thousands of slaves. This was a warning to all would-be rebels just how dangerous sedition against Rome would be. And so, decades later, Pontius Pilate, from within the view of the first century, from Rome's perspective, made a perfectly sensible leadership maneuver when he turned Jesus over to his accusers. Pilate understood that the peace of a region is more important than the innocence or guilt of one solitary man. If you take issue with Rome's moral calculus, ask the mothers of sons lost in senseless wars whether the punishment of one questionable foreigner is worth one less war. What of Jesus' mourners? Were there many? The slave Spartacus had 6,000 followers, and they were all crucified with him. But what of Jesus? How many of his followers were willing to die with him on Golgotha? History reports that he was crucified between two strangers, not two followers. The contingent of those who came in sympathy was so small that his mother represented 25% of the crowd. His maternal aunt represented another 25%. And 75% of the audience mourning Jesus' crucifixion was named Mary. Even the noonday sun decided to be absent. The only male present was a rather dreamy devotee, the kind of young, misguided eccentric that always seems to follow around cult criminals like Barabbas and Charles Manson, Pablo Escobar. Men these youngsters deem merely misunderstood. But surely the most startling absence on that day, according to the records, was the absence, seemingly, of God. All theological, all Christological explanations aside, Christians should not so easily explain away Jesus' so-called cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Only a religion for losers would base its faith on a God who sounded, if only for a moment, as if he, too, were an atheist. And yet, this is what Christianity did. How about Christianity's chief apostle, the Apostle Peter? Let's look at him for a moment, outside the lens of later times. Let's go back into the first century and look into the record. What kind of loser do we have here? One night he swears he'll always come to Jesus' defense, no matter the cost. The very next night, as a unit of soldiers comes to arrest the minor irritant Jesus, Peter so ably defends his master that he takes a swing not at one of the arresting soldiers. No, he's so incompetent that he directs his attack at an unarmed slave. And at close quarters, he aims for the head of the slave, but misses, as usual. He catches only the ear. And he abandons the one to whom 24 hours earlier he swore an undying allegiance. But is this the end of the chief apostle's disgraceful night? No. In this comedy of errors, he has at least one more show of incompetence in him. Outside City Hall, while his master's standing bound and shivering on this cold, late winter, early spring twilight, powerful enemies all around, Peter is caught warming himself by a fire. 3 figures accuse him of being one of Jesus' disciples. Are these powerful interrogators? Not in the least. The first accusation comes from a slave. And I want you to please note, the text of John draws particular attention to the fact that she's a slave girl. So she's not only a slave who would have no standing in the ancient world, but she's not a woman. She's a girl. Peter the Great, Peter the Saint, Peter the Shepherd, Peter the Prince, Peter the Rock. Here he is, disarmed and rendered utterly craven by a mere girl. And to put Peter's cowardice in perspective, while Peter is busy distancing himself from Jesus, Judas Iscariot heads back to Caiaphas' house, where he will publicly, at greatest risk to himself, confess his sins and the innocence of Jesus. His contrition is so complete that to secure Jesus' freedom, he's even willing to part with his ill-gotten coins, the only thing that Judas ever loved. The difference between Peter and Judas: Peter might have been sorrowful once the cock crowed, but he lived to see the celebration at Pentecost only because he seems to have been less remorseful than Judas, who in an eerie reverse mirror image of Jesus hung himself from a tree. Only a religion for losers would choose a Peter to deliver its inaugural address, and yet this is exactly what Christianity did. How about the Apostle Paul, the man most responsible for Christianity's theological underpinnings? This man, if you read his letters carefully and read Acts carefully, from the first century perspective, has loser written all over him. He's named after the tallest man in Israel, as I mentioned the other day. But his nickname is Paulos, or Tiny. And if that's any indication, he was unusually slight and feeble and unimpressive. And from his letters, people expected him to show up like a mighty trumpet, but what they got instead was a kazoo. A few exhibits. Exhibit A, probably the most clownish moment in Paul's career, came early on in Luke's history of the apostles' journey. What was Paul thinking in telling the story of how he had to escape his assailants by being lowered from the Damascus city wall in a basket? As we all know, or as we all don't know these days, the highest honor a Roman soldier can be given was the honor of the medal called the Coronus Muralis. It's the medal given to the soldier who is the first to risk his life by climbing over the enemy's city wall and into the city. It's almost as if Paul's life as a Christian is from the outset a comical parody of the honorable Roman soldier. Anyone with any sense would tell a story of how a brave man climbed the wall, stormed the enemy city, but not Paul. Look at him, crouching in a basket, dropping inch by inch from a rope, and finally landing, but on the wrong side of the wall. He has the opposite of whatever the opposite of the Coronus Muralis is. He has it. He was running away from, it seems, instead of bravely into trouble. Romans were proud and strong in their own eyes. They picked up the world by the scruff of the neck and gave it progress, whether they wanted it or not. But it's almost as if Paul glorified in what the Romans would be ashamed of. He wallowed in weakness. And if none of this is sufficient to persuade you of Paul's status, consider that his chief opponents came from the ranks of his own people primarily, fellow Jews and Christians. From his own pen, we learn that he was beaten within an inch of his life by his own people 5 times. He left no city without helping himself to a full treatment of its prison system. No sooner would Paul leave a congregation than that congregation would practically trip over itself to find better preachers. While other more sensible men inspired their audiences with sermons filled with visions of the third heaven, Paul stubbornly insisted that the grandest vision of God anyone could ever see was of him hanging bodily from a cross. From the Roman perspective, Paul shamelessly fetishized what everyone else in that day had the good sense to avoid. Most audiences are taken with grand visions of glory. Paul, give them a strong God, a cunning God, a reasonable God, a wise God, a Roman God, a Jupiter, a Mars. Who wants to claim that a weak God capable of bleeding and dying was their maker? The Romans wanted to believe that they were descended from a God above all that. And whatever you do, Paul, avoid offending the people's sensibilities by depicting a God who reminds them they're sinners. But no, Paul never had this gift of harnessing people's desires to be flattered. And the more his vision repulsed people, and the more they begged for a higher, more satisfying vision of God, the more Paul foolishly, in their eyes, quote, determined to know nothing except Christ in him crucified. It's as if it never occurred to Paul that life in this world was ugly enough. He had to make heaven ugly too and fill it with a bleeding God. And at the climax of these, again, from the Roman perspective, insane grotesqueries, he fantasized that he was being himself crucified with Christ. For the Romans, this was all very pathetic. Foolishness. We won't even go into that episode at Troas, where he literally bored a listener to death with his preaching. Probably like I'm doing right now. Only a religion for losers would allow such a man's musings to fill the pages of its holy book, and this is what Christianity did. Now, those are the chief architects of the Christian faith. But now I want to turn our attention to Rome, and I want to give it the same critical look that I just gave early Christianity. The religion of the Roman Empire, like the empire itself, was built to last forever. The city carefully studied the empires of the past and noticed that they fell in part because they failed to respect the customs of the peoples they conquered. So everywhere Rome went, Rome tried to leave the local religion in place and adapt itself to its environment, because Rome considered that its religion was not a religion for losers, it was a religion for winners. Rome was sensitive to cultural sensibilities. It was really the world's first multicultural culture. The religion of Rome was practiced as far west as Spain and as far east as what is today the borders of Iran. It built impressive temples and brought wealth and riches to cities far and wide. But a Rome and a religion for winners comes at great cost. Rome was supposed to give dignity to its sons and daughters. It taught them the value of civic and familial virtue. A religion for winners places examples of strength before its children. So, when Rome talks about its gods are strong and beautiful and flawless. Fathers and mothers are the pictures of strength. The Roman Caesar as father to the nation and God to his kingdom mirrors both. But in truth, no other civilization, save perhaps the Carthaginian Empire and the Canaanites, practiced the art of infanticide the way Rome did. Roman fathers regarded their daughters as little more than a nuisance and routinely had their infant daughters strangled, drowned, or left out on a hillside to be eaten by wild animals. And I am not exaggerating. This is not sensationalism. This is history. This practice in the 2nd century reached such prevalence that according to extant census records, only 1 in 60 Roman families had more than one daughter. And the ratio of men to women in the Roman Empire was, by some estimates, something like 60% men and 40% women, which is a massive, massive distortion of natural ratios, which without this kind of interference, they're always around 50-50. To do that kind of thing takes intense social engineering. Romans didn't usually permit children with severe physical defects to live. The only way Rome could be strong was to rid itself of the weak. Most of the Roman populace consisted of slaves, and the vast majority of the slave children were pressed into prostitution, little girls for the brothels, servicing the men of the warrior and patrician classes, little boys who would serve as malakoi, or passive sexual partners for the more respectable Roman patricians. The strongest slaves were forced to become gladiators, who had a life expectancy of 27. But the citizens needed entertainment. Sure, this might all seem a bit unpleasant, but Rome is building a religion for winners. Rome's Caesars were the pictures of wisdom, supposedly, and of sound mind, which is probably why Julius Caesar was a megalomaniac. Tiberius Caesar, his greatest joy was soaking in his spa with children. Caligula was a paranoid schizophrenic who literally married his horse and took pleasure in kissing his wife's neck and, according to Suetonius, whispering, "So beautiful a neck must be cut whenever I please." He invited one day all of his senators to a banquet, and upon their arrival, the senators saw the windows covered by black drapes. This was an unsteady Caesar. They walked on pins and needles. They noticed that the walls were painted black. The floor was black. The table was black. The plates, the candles, the silverware, all black. The food on the plates, the food was black too. Each dish was garnished by small black tombstones. It wasn't Halloween. It was Caligula's dinner party from hell. The senators dined believing this was their Last Supper. They ate mysteriously blackened meat that they couldn't find where it originated from. Caligula had fear for dessert. Claudius, the next Caesar, was a raging anti-Semite. Nero was Nero. He had himself declared God in his own lifetime. He castrated a boy named Sporus and then married him. And allegedly he copulated with his own mother. The Emperor Domitian enjoyed being a part of Rome's religion for winter so much that he stared out upon vistas of boredom. He whiled away the hours of his life, according to Suetonius, stabbing flies with his pen. While Christians were creeping down into dark, secret places of the empire and carrying the light and the future of the world with them, Rome was busy, leaving no perversion untried, no blasphemy unspoken, no creeping thing unworshipped, no cruelty unpracticed. And in that time, the time at which Paul is writing, there arose a cult dedicated to the worship of the emperors. A whole priestcraft and priest guild was built, especially in the eastern half of the empire, to worship the emperors and facilitate rituals for appeasing the emperors and coercing the population into worshiping those emperors. The priests of the divine emperors built temples dedicated to Caesar and enforced mandatory pledges in their names. In due course, though, the cult began to wane somewhat in its enthusiasm. There was, around the year 65, 66, what was called the Year of the Four Emperors, Otho, Galba, Vitellius, Vespasian. All in 1 year they died, one right after the other, assassinations. And it drained the population of its enthusiasm for this new religion of the emperors. So the priests, though, they had to have a job. They devised new schemes for generating revenue and awe. So what they did was they hired some clever propagandists. And one of those later propagandists for propping up Rome's state religion, his name was Hieron of Alexandria. Sort of, if you get the idea of a kind of a televangelist. This was what Hieron of Alexandria was, essentially. He was an engineer who had recently invented a series of mechanical marvels. He designed a machine which he called the Aeolipile. It was a steam engine prototype. Then he also built the world's first vending machine. And then third, he invented a fountain that operated autonomously and used hydrostatic electricity. Fourth, he created a suite of machines designed specifically for theater, mechanical marionettes that could perform on command. They would fly through the air, they could dance, they could mime. And then he also created a thunder generator, pyrotechnics, all of these automated and governed by a hidden programmable device underneath the temple floors. The imperial priests exploited these devices. They hired him to put these devices in the temples dedicated to the Caesars. The gadgetry, as I mentioned, was hidden from view. Pipes, pulleys, counterweights, pressurized tubes, sealed steam chambers below the floors, behind the walls. And so, get the picture. A crowd of worshipers show up. The priests go through their duties, their rituals, lifting prayers, reciting the liturgy, praying that the divine Caesars would bless the people. And now the priests would urge the people to praise the emperor more loudly. Their cries became a chant, and once they've satisfied the priests with their show of devotion, a signal was given, and the engines would begin mysteriously to go to work underneath the temple floor. The statues of the imperial family began to levitate. A fire appears out of nowhere, seemingly, and consumes the sacrifice on the altar. The fountain in the temple spews water in a graceful arc. Dancing figures appear. The sound of thunder cascades from underneath the imperial throne. And statues of the old Greco-Roman gods bow their heads in deference to the emperors, as if this is the new and true religion. The audience stands amazed at these marvels. Women cover their mouths. Men fall on their knees and begin to sob. An elderly man, I would imagine, lifts his eyes to heaven and blinks and thanks Saturn that he's living to see the day of miracles and the divinity of the emperor. The reverie is interrupted, though, when a great voice emanates from the emperor's statue in the center of the temple. The crowd thinks it's the emperor himself speaking. But in fact, the voice is coming from beneath the floor, where a priest commands the people to worship the emperor alone and promises blessings upon their family. He's speaking in a tube that is underneath the floor, and he's crouched underneath the floor as well in a little capsule, speaking through that tube, which goes up through the mouth of the emperor. And the shell-shocked crowd, awed into submission, stands and whispers, "Who is like the Caesars? And who can wage war against them?" The priests dismiss. One mother, I imagine, takes her child to the statue of Artemis. The mother puts a coin in the child's hand, and on the other side of the coin there's a woman inscribed into the coin. It's the woman Dea Romana. She rides a great wolf and stands in the Tiber, surrounded by the 7 hills of Rome. And on the other side of the coin is the impress of the Caesar's head, with rays of sun streaming from his head, which signifies his divine status. To use this coin, whether it's to buy or sell food in the marketplace, is implicit assent to the coin's declaration that Caesar is Lord, and to him every knee shall bow. The young woman prods her frightened child standing in the shadow of Artemis. He holds the drachma, or the coin, in his hand and reluctantly puts it into the statue's hand itself. And the coin rolls into a slit in the palm and disappears into a slot in the elbow. Remember, Hieron invented the vending machine, and this was exactly what it was through the statues of the emperors and the gods. And for the child's receipt, this coin, when it rolled into the elbow, set in motion a mechanism that caused a little teardrop to fall from the statue's eyes. Here again, the voice of the New Testament prophet John. Long before the farce was uncovered for the public, he foresaw these kinds of machinations and declared, "The dragon has given power to the beast to perform wonders, to call down fire, to speak blasphemies." In other words, as John saw it, the imperial cult was giving power to the image of the emperors and making them out to be gods. Rome poured its energies into communicating its propaganda of the Caesars through impressive architecture. And in its propaganda, Rome was symbolized by the goddess Dea Romana, as I mentioned, a woman riding a beast. Her divine husband was reigning Caesar, standing astride the earth and sea, one foot on land, the other on the sea. And in every temple, there was a statue of the goddess Nike, or Nike. She was known for the symbolism of holding in one hand a palm branch, and in the other hand she would hold what was called the Stephanos tes Zoes, or the victor's crown of life. So a palm branch in one hand, the victor's crown in the other. Her constant presence throughout the empire in these temples, it was a constant reminder that Rome was number one. To be part of Rome was to be a conqueror, to wear the victor's crown. But John's revelation takes Rome's own propaganda and turns it on its head. He pulls the veil aside in heaven and shows that Rome's pretensions to messianic power are just a comic parody of the true power that resides in heaven. Dea Romana is merely Rome's crass attempt to achieve the majesty of the holy bride of Christ. Rome is the great victor, or as it called itself, Ho Nikon, or the overcomer. It's just a tragic farce. In fact, it's a parody of the true Ho Nikon, Jesus of Nazareth, who has, quote, overcome the world. Moreover, instead of Rome being number one and holding the palm branch in one hand and wearing a victor crown upon its head, it will be the saints of God who hold the palm branch in one hand and wear the victor's crown, according to Revelation chapter 7. Satan prepares a messianic imitation, a false Christ, in each and every generation, awaiting the final showdown when the Lord Jesus will suddenly descend with a shout. And as it was then, so it is now. In every age, the enemy of our soul offers an alternate Messiah, an alternative Shema, an alternative priesthood, an alternative eternal city, an alternative peace, an alternative salvation. In a word, our enemy is always in the business of crafting a religion of Nike, or the victor, a religion that appeals to our pride, a religion that flatters us, a religion in which only winners need to apply. But we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. We have the holy word of God and the testimony of the saints. The early Christians simply outlasted the empire. As the water of a river quietly outlasts the jagged boulder that lies in its path, imperceptibly wearing it away by steady persistence over the centuries. When we think back on how the faith of Christ overcame the empire, we sometimes imagine that Christianity grew through massive revivals. And I need you to hear me carefully. This idea of Christianity spreading through massive revivals has a lot to do with a reading of Luke's Acts. The Christian physician does record a few mass conversions, particularly on the day of Pentecost. But the record of these events, notice carefully, were to rightly divide the word. The record of these events merely describes the church's very earliest days and not the second half of the first century. Moreover, the kind of mass conversions that Luke describes seem to have occurred primarily and maybe even exclusively in Judea. In point of fact, the church of the second and third centuries grew through more conventional methods. Its growth was so stunning, though, that during these centuries, by the time Rome understood what had happened to it, the only way Rome of the 4th century could survive was to join it. Let me explain. I mentioned earlier that the Greco-Roman practice gave priority to male children. Females were routinely aborted in utero, or exposed, or simply smothered or poisoned after birth, thrown into the city dump, or exposed on hills to be eaten by beasts. This practice was not confined to the morally defective few. It was common practice for the most virtuous, quote unquote, Romans of the day. To illustrate this point, I want you to consider the following letter. I've taken a little piece from a letter, an ancient letter. It was composed by what seems to be your average Roman family man of the 2nd century empire. His name was, records show, Hilarion, and he was writing to his wife named Alice. Here's what he writes. Know that I am still in Alexandria, Alice, and do not worry if the servants all come back and I remain in Alexandria. I ask and beg you to take good care of our baby son. And as soon as I receive payment, I shall send it up to you. Now, here. If you are delivered of a child before I come home, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. You've sent me word and you've said, don't forget me. How can I forget you, Alice? I beg you not to worry about me. I quoted the last two sentences even though it doesn't mention the abortion or the discarding of the girl, because I wanted you to see the tenderness of this man. He was obviously in love with his wife, Alice, and worried about her being anxious. And yet, he speaks of a potential daughter as a piece of meat that, if left out, might attract the maggots. Early Christians, though, followed the teachings of Paul and insisted that men and women had equal standing before Christ. Children were not to be aborted. They were a gift from God, whether they were male or female, healthy or deformed. The Didache, which is a late 1st century, early 2nd century Christian document, explicitly forbids the destruction of the unborn. It says, you shall not abort a child or commit infanticide. Another late 1st century document written by the Christians, it's called the Epistle of Barnabas, it warns, you shall not slay the child by procuring abortion, nor again shall you destroy it after it's born. You shall not withdraw your hand from your son or from your daughter, but from their infancy you shall teach them the fear of the Lord. Now imagine the long-term implications of these policies. Rome is killing its daughters. Christianity is valuing them. There are roughly 2 or 3 boys in the Roman Empire for every girl. This ratio is unsustainable and lethal to civilization. But the situation is even worse than I've just described for ancient Rome. One can't simply think in terms of the ratio of boys to girls. The ratio needs to account not for men to women, but rather the ratio of men to available women. Prostitution and concubinage were rampant in the empire. Some men were able to hoard women having one wife and a collection of concubines. And one only has to take a trip to, say, Pompeii to see the brothel houses. They were everywhere. So adjust for these factors. The ratio of men to marriageable women might have been something like 4 men for every 1 woman. And to say that the Greco-Roman men were having great difficulty finding a wife in the 2nd century is an understatement. But there was no such problem in the early church. In fact, the ratio of Christian men to Christian women seems to have slightly tilted towards women. Where are the Roman men of the empire beginning to look for marriageable women in the 2nd and 3rd centuries? They're looking for them in the church. But the church has a strict policy. Christians cannot marry outside the faith. What fellowship does light have with darkness? So unmarried pagan men often found themselves inclined to listen more patiently to the good news. So over a period of 2 centuries, Christianity, strengthened by its teachings, paganism, enfeebled by its practices, went entirely separate ways sociologically. Christians had large, healthy families. Pagans had small families, further weakened by routine promiscuity and sexual rivalry. Christian families retained their children and created a center of gravity strong enough to hold multiple generations in its orbit, while the offspring of pagan unions were increasingly detached, the product of non-family conjugation. Christian children usually lived with an affectionate father, a grandfather, sometimes a great-grandfather, while usually the pagan child was born of a prostitute or a concubine and would be lucky to know who his own father was. Parenthetically, the greatest revivals can be found in our own pews, among our children. When Israel was looking for a great, strong hero to lead them out of slavery, God sent them a child. When Israel needed deliverance from their enemies in the Promised Land, God sent them the baby Samson. When Israel needed deliverance from the Philistines, God sent them the youth David. When the world needed salvation and was looking for a strong and mighty Messiah, a babe was born in Bethlehem. When God is about to do something big, he usually starts with the children. And today, while we might look for the great day when our altars will suddenly be full of sinners, adult sinners, waiting to be baptized, there's a potential revival already sitting on our pews in the form of our children. The revival that outlasted the Roman Empire. Was not a sudden revival, but was instead a steady and patient revival. The kind of revival that might take 30 or 60 or 100 years to realize. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but the ideologies that are currently hostile to Christianity today are generally, they share one thing in common. The homosexual movement, the transgender movement, the feminist movement, the secularist leftist movement, the abortion movement, the pornography movement, the climate change movement, they all share a strange and terrible pattern. They hate children. They see the reproduction of the human race as an evil. For the typical millennial, your great-grandmother had 8 children. Your grandmother had 5 children. Your mother had 3 children. You, the millennial, have 2 abortions and a dog. This is simply unsustainable. For a movement to last, it has to have children. So these horrible ideologies all have a self-destruct mechanism buried deep within its programming. Those who hate God, the scripture says, love death. This is why the secularists are all so desperate to take over the public school system. They don't want to have their own children. They want to pass on their madness to our children. Ultimately, the goal is a satanic goal. Satan hates the human race. We're going to outlast it. Are you worried? Are you worried about where Christianity is going, where the apostolic faith is going, and where the world seems to be so prevalent? I mean, it's just done a massive takedown of Disney. Massive. I mean, just stormed the ramparts in like the last 15 years and completely conquered it. And you're standing back like, wow, this is powerful. This is frightening. Oh my goodness, what's next? Guess what? They hate kids. Can't last. It's all sterile. Literally, I mean, I'm not using that word symbolically. I'm using that word literally. It's sterile. Can't last. Meanwhile, apostolic families are saying, let's have kids. Let's get married. Let's have families. Let's bring them to the house of God. Which of the two is going to outlast? If the Lord tarries in 100 years, this secularist wave that we're seeing right now is just going to die of natural causes. The Lord told Jeremiah at a similar moment in history that we're in today, when they were surrounded by the Babylonians. What did Jeremiah say? That the Lord said, go hide yourself? No. He said, build ye houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. Seek the peace of the city. Mom and dad, having a family is a revival. Teaching them the apostolic faith is a revival. The early church had other traits that contributed to this astonishing success. The church was not afraid of death. Not afraid of death. I want you to consider the differences between the names that the Christian, or the name that the Christian and the pagans gave their graves. The pagan Romans referred to their graveyard as a necropolis, or city of the dead. For them, the grave was a place of permanent separation. When one died, one could expect to go to a cold and lonely Hades, where you would live out an eternity in a disembodied state. The Christian, though, believed that this life was often the place, it was this life that was the place of alienation and suffering. But the next life would be a life of intimacy with God and family and the saints. So the Christians never referred to their grave as a city of the dead. They called their graveyard a koimaterion, or cemetery, which means the sleeping place. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be raised. For Christians, death meant rest and life with God, not separation. I want to give you an example of how powerful this idea was in the everyday practices of the early church. The city of Alexandria, once had a plague in the early centuries of the church. It wiped out COVID, times 1,000. It wiped out half of the city of Alexandria. Massive city. And the rest of the population was sent to their sick beds. As the casualties mounted, the world's leading expert in medicine, Galen. It's a slip. He ran for his life and abandoned the people he should have had the fortitude to heal. The Christians in that city, they were a small and persecuted minority. They were hated by most of the Alexandrians. Alexandria was the intellectual center of the world. It was University City. It was Oxford. And Christians were just ridiculously pathetic rednecks. When the plague came, though, the Christians emerged and were the only people in the city willing to tend to the sick. They showed no fear. Unlike the pagans, they lived with death on a daily basis. During the crisis, they built the world's first hospital system. They nursed thousands of pagans back to health. And when the plague was gone and the dead were buried and the living were whole again, they marveled, the city marveled at the Christian benefactors, the people they had once loathed. And like a weed living in a dark prison, turning towards a stray beam of light, trying to solve the enigma of its existence, pagan Alexandria turned towards Christianity. And here, finally in the world, was light, something different, something greater than death. The Christians single-handedly saved that ancient city, and Alexandria never forgot them. And it became Christian long before Rome did. Alas, our ancient enemy is still at work. Huron of Alexandria is very much with us today, though perhaps we should call him Huron of Silicon Valley. He still designs technical marvels in the service of the worship of the state. We have our own secular science priestcraft intent on enforcement. But the same Spirit who said to John, "Come up here and I shall show you what shall take place hereafter," makes the same invitation to the faithful today. From the perspective of the throne of the Lamb, secularism and scientism have all but died and are being propped up by their own mutual rigor mortis. What does applied postmodernism have to show for itself? How about the gender studies cul-de-sac? Gender dysphoria, secular doctrines with no limiting principles. Secularism has made life in the 21st century impossible and unbearable for so many, that you might say that the official emotion of the 21st century is anxiety, with loneliness as a close second. Israel followed a holy cloud through the wilderness, but the cloud that modern man follows might fitly be described as a cloud of narcotics. We have justice in our world without virtue, peace without love, sin without forgiveness, sleep without rest, matrimony without holiness, time without eternity. Rest in peace, young prince. The wolf is on his way, and your day is coming to an end. This is a dark world. It's been said that there are many ways we can hold off the darkness, but not for long. Eventually, the lights of our lives, love, health, intelligence, work, competence, political and economic stability, they all go out one by one. And when that happens, the world will need more than our cold secular baubles and trinkets can give. Our weeping, the Christians' weeping, will endure for a night, but our joy is coming on the horizon. For those of us not bound by the tyranny of the present, a secular victory can only be ephemeral and will amount to a little more than a pop gun fired at an army that won the war 20 centuries ago. From the perspective of eternity, the kingdom of God thunders in the skies and has come to the earth and flung open its gates to all the sinners. But yet the secular critic sits like two toads on the bank of a muddy pond, croaking, "We've won, we've won." While the world recruits its emissaries from among the healthy, socially well-adjusted winners, the Christian faith has always raised its force from the rubble. Not many wise, not many mighty, not many noble. Our cornerstone is the stone that the builders rejected. But when the secular dreams and idols inevitably become mere museum pieces set next to Aphrodite and Horus and Zeus, the church will thunder still through the ages, worshiping the one and only true God. Now the secularist assumes that Christianity has been rendered obsolete, superseded by science and rationalism. But who does the modern scoffer think we are? A resistance formed last week, or last year, or last decade, or last century, or last millennium? No, we have stared down bigger, badder, and more determined foes before. If we weren't extinguished, when there were just a handful of us against an entire empire, what hope can our enemy possibly have? As the name of Christ is declared in every nation. But even if every last one of us are buried deep in the earth, let our enemy see to it that he sets a guard upon the tombs and seals them shut, and cover the valley of our dry bones in miles of dirt. But still, beware, for all it would take for those bones to become an army again for our God is for one prophet to say one word. I've been hearing for decades now that the church is dying. But every time the church has gone to the dogs, it's the dog that dies. The enemy of God had better hope that Christianity is not dying. There is no place in the universe the church is more lethal than in the grave. Secularism was born in the gentle shade of the Christian culture, but Christians were conceived not on a bed of leisure. We were conceived on a cross. We were delivered in a tomb. We were born in the dark. We learned to speak on Pentecost while the world mocked us. We took our first steps under the rain of the world's stones. We were raised in catacombs. We were educated in the lion's mouth. We became men at the stake. Do you imagine, world, that you can invent a few toys, make a few gadgets, propose a few new philosophies, and we'll suddenly go away if you take over a few hundred college campuses, and win a few elections, and confuse a few generations, and that's it? We're just going to go surrender into the night? Oh, no, 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 no. You don't know us very well. You can put us on a hill and crucify our hands and feet and you can put a sword in our side. But that's when we come to life. So again, I warn you, if you say that Christianity is dying, watch out. There's about to be a resurrection that shakes the earth. We have been called irrelevant since Calvary. And we will be called irrelevant right up to the moment the trumpet sounds. There have been Christians like Paul and Peter and John and Stephen and Polycarp and Praxeas and Phoebe and Antipas, for whom it would have been easier to rope the sun and turn it unhesitatingly with the axe suspended above their neck as when they spoke in the safety of their small gatherings. They spoke the truth in the face of lies. and with the threat of the sword and the fire. And we are their children. Apostolics made of the same stuff, filled with the same Spirit, and baptized in the same saving name. I close. 11 years ago or so, as an American seminary student, I found myself standing on the Areopagus, the same rock formation near the Acropolis where, just 20 centuries earlier, the Apostle Paul delivered a stern warning to Athens' Stoics and Epicureans. It was a cool Sunday morning for me, just before dawn. And I had been asked by our guide to give a devotional to my fellow seminarians at daylight. I was very nervous to begin, and then tourists from outside our group started gathering around and listening in too, and really made it awkward. I made it through the devotional, but I had the hardest time making it devotional. I felt intimidated. The group dissipated when I was done, and I was left alone for a few minutes to explore the ancient hill where Paul stood. The sun had now come up several degrees on the horizon, and then suddenly, church bells all across the city of Athens, from borough to borough, waterfront to Acropolis, began to ring. Athens came to life. The sound was almost deafening, hauntingly beautiful. 1,000 churches, literally 1,000 churches, announced that it was Sunday, the day that Christ rose from the grave. 20 centuries earlier, my forefather in the faith, Paul, when he stood there, there were no churches. And there were no bells to ring in a Sunday morn. At that time, the city acknowledged its gods with stunning artistry. The Parthenon atop the Acropolis, erected in honor of Athena, was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Everywhere one looked in Paul's day, there were monuments so vast and luxurious that Athenians had no need to persuade its citizens to worship its gods. If a stranger asked them if Athena is powerful, the Athenian could simply point to the Parthenon and say, could something that doesn't exist build that? It was into this atmosphere that the Apostle Paul, a solitary Jew, having not a single monument built in the world except a wooden cross to point to as evidence of the truth he spoke, bearing only the words and testimony of his mouth, he stood atop this same hill and lectured the very religious Athenians on the subject of their and his religion. He must have made quite a spectacle that day. Indeed, the philosophers called him a spermologus, or babbler, an insult both then and now. Something about this hill, I suppose, attracts the philosophical in us and makes us feel just a little bit superior, whether it be today or yesterday. The nearby Parthenon cast a menacing shadow over Paul, and his sermon concluded with the sound not of solemnity, but the jeer of laughter. Who could have guessed that 2 centuries hence, this insignificant Jew and his Lord would dominate this city? Who then could have guessed that the Parthenon would soon be nothing more than a museum, crumbling, a monument to ancient superstition? I had merely given a devotional to a mostly sympathetic audience and felt a little intimidated, but he stood alone, very alone, the only Christian in the city and one of the few in the entire world. The God he worshiped was, for the Athenians, the unknown God. I've also visited the Mamertine prison in Rome, where Paul is believed to have lived his last hours. And if this was indeed the place, he was lowered through a hole, the same hole through which guards would slide buckets for food and waste onto a stone dungeon floor 11 feet below. And Paul is here living his last hours. He was once a free man, roaming the earth, but now he only had a couple of feet. His circle of friends, once robust, dwindled by the day as death hung overhead. Paul died after the fashion of his master, alone. But how satisfying it would have been for Paul, the man who lived between the lightning of the resurrection and the thunder of his Lord's return, to hear these church bells ringing that I had heard on that Sunday morning. And to know that Athens Christians, nominal or otherwise, now outnumber the worshipers of Athena, roughly 3 million to 0. And so, before descending the stairs to leave Mars Hill, I took one last look around. When Paul was here, the Stoics and the Epicureans were the dominant culture makers, the purveyors of wisdom, the avant-garde, the future of the world. The only two viable and reasonable worldviews. As I walked down the stairs, listening to the bells, I could hear the voice of the ancient apostle whom men called Tiny. The man who received a revelation on the road to Damascus that he would not die of old age. I hear him speaking just above the din of the scoffing philosophers. Where is the philosophers of this world? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And indeed, where are they today? These philosophies and religions for winners are long gone. Nero had Paul executed. But today, we call our dogs Nero and our sons Paul. It's only a matter of time before the heavenly song the ancient prophet heard is fulfilled. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. This is your heritage. Live it, breathe it, dream it, love it, pass it down. Let's come to the altar this morning.
Jesus, 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 there's just something about that name. Master, Savior, like a fragrance after the rain. Jesus, 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 let all heaven and earth proclaim. Kings and kingdoms may all pass away, but there's something about that name. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. There's just something about that name. Master, Savior, Jesus, like a fragrance after. Jesus, 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 let all heaven and earth proclaim. Kings and kingdoms shall all pass away, because there's something about down from his glory.